Deep in the forgotten highlands of eastern Oregon, cloaked by time and generations of silence, lies a truth so chilling that local authorities kept it buried for over a century. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 settlers disappeared without a trace along a mere 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail. These weren't deaths from disease or misfortune. No, something darker stalked this land. Something calculated, cold, human. At the heart of this nightmare stood the Sacred Heart Chapel, a humble wooden church that promised weary pioneers salvation and rest. But in reality, it became the headquarters for the most systematic mass murder ring in the history of the American frontier. What began as isolated disappearances evolved into a family-run machine of death, so meticulously engineered, it redefined evil itself. The Grayson family didn't just kill. They orchestrated murder with the precision of surgeons and the detachment of bookkeepers. They kept records, detailed handwritten accounts of every soul they erased, every household they destroyed, and every dream they left buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Before we take our descent into the abyss, the story of the Grayson family and their path of destruction, I have to ask you something important. This channel isn't for the faint of heart. It's not for those who prefer sugar-coated history or bedtime fairy tales. It's for the rare few willing to confront the shadows of America's past. If that's you, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which state you're tuning in from. Your support allows us to tell the stories that others fear to even whisper. Now journey with me back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail, a promise of new life, instead delivered unthinkable horror. This trail stretched across 2,000 miles of raw, unforgiving wilderness, America's great artery to the west. For tens of thousands of hopeful families, each mile westward holds the promise of a better life, but also the threat of death, illness, starvation, storms, accidents. But in the rugged hills of eastern Oregon, death comes with a different face. It wore the robes of Christian virtue. It speaks in scripture. It offered help, a place to rest. And then it took everything. The year 1852 marked the pinnacle of migration on the Oregon Trail. Over 50,000 people attempted the perilous westward journey. By the time wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains, they had already endured nearly 1,800 miles of backbreaking travel. Families were exhausted. Food was scarce. Disease ran rampant. Children crying with fever. Grandparents died by the roadside. Dreams bleed out into desperation. It was in this broken landscape that Father Morai Grayson appeared, founding the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The chapel, simple and weather-worn, sat atop a hill, like a sentry above a natural resting point on the trail. A place where pioneers commonly stopped to water their oxen, mend broken wheels, and bury their dead. To the suffering and the grieving, the chapel looked like a gift from heaven, a refuge of mercy, a light in the wilderness. Father Morai was in his 40s, tall and skeletal, with icy gray eyes that could silence a room. He mentioned to be a missionary sent to minister to the spiritual needs of traveling families. His sermons were eloquent, his scripture deep. Even the most cautious pioneers found themselves reassured by his solemn, authoritative presence. By his side stood his wife, who called herself Sister Constance, a woman with a calm demeanor and an uncanny talent for medicine. To mothers with dying children and fathers weakened by fever, she seemed like an angel in human form. Then there was Brother Ezekiel Morai's younger brother, less imposing, more practical, good with tools, friendly with animals, always ready to lend a hand with wagon repairs or livestock. Together, the three of them project an image of Christian devotion so convincing it disarmed the most guarded of travelers. The Sacred Heart Chapel was unassuming, a single-room building crafted from local timber. Beside it lay a small cemetery dotted with wooden crosses, a silent promise that if death came, it would come with dignity and prayer. Inside the chapel, rough-hewn pews faces a plain altar, but what the travelers didn't know was that the cemetery was larger than it looked. Much larger. And not all of its graves were marked. In the shadowed hills of eastern Oregon, hidden beneath layers of dust, denial of truth, and deliberate erasure, lies a so harrowing that it was smothered by local authorities for more than 100 years. Between the years 1852 and 1888, over 800 pioneers disappeared without explanation along a lonely 20-mile stretch of the Oregon Trail. These weren't victims of cholera or runaway wagons. No. These were disappearances born of something far more sinister, something that wore a cross, smiled kindly, and held a Bible in one hand and a shovel in the other. At the center of this horror stood the Sacred Heart Chapel. To weary travelers, it appears as a modest wooden sanctuary promising spiritual rest and salvation. But behind its weathered doors lurked a quiet monstrosity. The chapel was the beating heart of what would become the most cold-blooded, methodically executed mass murder operation in American frontier history. What began as a few suspicious discoveries turned into a family-run death machine. A machine so precise, so horrifyingly efficient, that it did more than just kill it, turned murder into ritual. The Grayson family didn't simply rob and murder, they documented. They tallied lives like they were inventory. They kept ledgers of sorrow, names, ages, families, dates. Dreams reduced to numbers scribbled between pages now long rotted in the ground. Before we descend into this nightmare, before we pull back the veil on the darkest corners of American westward expansion, I must ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone. It's not for the curious. It's for the brave. The ones unafraid to confront the bloodstains history tried to bleach out. If you're still here, if you're one of us, subscribe now and drop a comment with the name of your state. Your support allows us to keep digging, to keep telling the stories others won't dare whisper. Now, let's rewind the clock, back to 1852. Back to the blood-soaked soil of a trail that offered hope and delivered horror. The Oregon Trail was more than a path, it was a symbol. A 2,000-mile artery cutting across the American wilderness, pulsing with the dreams of families chasing a new beginning. Thousands sold everything they owned for a place in a wagon train, each step forward a gamble with fate. Disease, starvation, flood, fire. It took many. But in eastern Oregon, death didn't come from above or below. It came smiling, with a hymn on its lips. In those emerald hills, cloaked in mist and pine, death wore the face of piety. It greeted travelers with warmth, offered prayers, spoke of salvation, then stripped them of everything: their assets, their names, their lives. The year 1852 marked the height of westward migration. Over 50,000 souls dared to make the trek. By the time most wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains, they had endured nearly 1,800 miles of brutal terrain. Their bodies were spent, their food stores depletion, their minds fraying. Trail fever, dysentery, infection, they thinned the ranks. But nothing could prepare them for what waited in Oregon's hills. It was here that a man named Father Morai Grayson laid the foundation of something monstrous. In 1851, he erected the Sacred Heart Chapel, a simple wooden building perched atop a hill beside a well-traveled resting point. Here, pioneers would often pause to water their oxen repair wagons and bury the loved ones they'd lost along the way. To the grieving, the Sacred Heart was a beacon of divine mercy, a place to find peace for the dead and strength for the living. Father Morai appears every bit the traveling preacher. He was tall, gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that held both fire and frost. His sermons were mesmerizing, his scriptures memorized word for word. Even skeptics found themselves nodding along, lulled by his reverence and apparent compassion. By his side stood a woman he called Sister Constance. She gently smiled softly and spoke healing herbs to the sick. Her touch was steady. Her presence is soothing. Mothers with dying children cling to her like a raft in a storm. And completing the trinity was Brother Ezekiel Morai's younger sibling. Less commanding, more grounded. He mended wagon wheels with practiced hands. He calmed panicked horses. He chatted with children. People trusted him. They needed to. Because in this world, kindness was the currency. Together, the Graysons embody Christian charity. They offered prayer, healing, food, and labor. But every gesture hides a blade. Every smile a lie. Their chapel was no sanctuary, it was a snare. The structure itself was plain but well tended. Hewn from local timber, it stands proudly against the wilderness backdrop. A small graveyard lay adjacent, a cluster of wooden crosses swaying in the wind. Inside, simple pews faced a makeshift altar. To the greatest, it felt humble, holy. But under that hallowed floor, something unholy festered. Something that will change the meaning of the word sanctuary forever. The poison always comes before the prayers. Sister Constance called it purification. She said that toxins must leave the body before healing could begin. But for young Samuel Morrison, the only thing that left his body was life itself. Within hours of taking her so-called medicine, his skin turned the color of ashes. His breath grew ragged. His body trembled with waves of vomiting and diarrhea so violent, his parents thought they'd lose him before sunrise. James Morrison, a cautious man by nature, began to worry out loud. He suggested they take Samuel east back toward the nearest trading post to seek proper help. But Father Morai gently placed a long, pale hand on James's shoulder and shook his head with solemn authority. "Brother James," he said, his voice as smooth as a hymn, "I've seen this sickness many times on the trail. Moving him now would be a death sentence. We must place our trust in the Lord and in Sister Constance's healing hands." And so they waited. and praying and watched. By the sixth day, 7-year-old Tommy began to fall ill. Then Mary, only 5, followed with the same stomach pains, the same pale skin, the same slow spiral downward. Sister Constance remains at their side every moment, whispering prayers, mixing tinctures, bathing their foreheads. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but nearly collapsed from stress and fear, she was a holy miracle, a saint sent to save them, but the reality was far darker than they could ever have imagined. The remedies that Sister Constance so lovingly administered were laced with arsenic, precisely measured, carefully dosed. The Graysons had discovered the deadly substance could be acquired from local mining outposts under the innocent guise of pest control. In small amounts, it mimicked common trail illnesses, abdominal pain, vomiting, fever, discoloration. But in time, it destroys the organs from within, and no one suspected a thing. Trail deaths were tragically common. Dysentery, typhoid consumption. They were ghosts that stalked every wagon train. When someone died, families didn't ask why. They simply mourned, buried the body, and moved on. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, Tommy on the 9th, Mary on the 11th. Each time Father Morai led the grieving with tearful sermons, his voice rising to the heavens, speaking of God's mercy and eternal rest to the broken-hearted parents. The Graysons were angels of comfort. But every night after Elizabeth had cried herself to sleep, Brother Ezekiel crept quietly through the wagon, making notes by lantern light. An inventory, a record of value. The Morrisons, it turned out, had been well off back in Missouri. Their wagon carried fine heirloom furniture, hand-forged tools, silver servingware, and most importantly, several hidden pouches of gold coins sewn into the linings of James's garments. On the 12th day, it was James himself who began to show the telltale signs. Elizabeth, now visibly pregnant and near the breaking point, begged Sister Constance to save her husband. She knelt, trembling, clutching the older woman's hands. What she received in return would one day haunt every investigator who heard the story. Sister Constance looked into her eyes and said softly, "Some illnesses, my dear child, are simply the Lord's way of calling His children home. We mustn't question His will, only trust in His mercy. Your husband will soon join your precious babies in paradise. And you will raise your new child knowing that your family awaits you in glory." James Morrison died on the 14th day. Just hours later, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. He lived only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai, who cradled the tiny infant with revival and watched him die. 3 days later, Elizabeth herself fell ill. She followed her family into the grave before the month was over. 6 people, 3 weeks, gone. And yet, no one questions asked. No one raised alarms. If a trader or fellow traveler came by and inquired about the Morrisons, the Graysons had their story ready. The family had arrived sick and weak. The mother, already with child, had been under tremendous strain. They had all fallen victim to a particularly virulent strain of dysentery, one that ravaged families from time to time. The Graysons, ever humble, said they had done all they could, risking their own health to comfort strangers in their final hours. To outsiders, it was a tragedy. A sad but not unusual tale from the trail. But to the Graysons, It was something else entirely. It was business. Father Moray assures that the Morrisons were laid to rest with all the appearances of Christian dignity. Their bodies were buried in the chapel cemetery, their assets consecrated to the Lord's work. He told anyone who asked a sanctimonious euphemism for theft that sounded holy enough to silence suspicion. But the Mauritians were only the beginning. What the Graysons discovered through that first annihilation would reshape not only their lives, but the very nature of evil on the Oregon Trail. They found that murder, when carried out with careful planning and wrapped in the language of salvation, could be not only efficient, but staggeringly profitable. It was more than just a killing. It was a revelation. The Morrison case became the blueprint. They learned that isolated families, those who lagged behind wagon trains or traveled alone, made for ideal targets. They learned that the slow creeping symptoms of arsenic poisoning mimicked the most common illnesses of the trail so well that no one would ever think to question them. And most importantly, they learned that their titles, father, sister, brother, granted them near absolute authority in the eyes of the grieving and the desperate. Their collars made them untouchable. Their crosses made them trusted. The Oregon Trail, they realized, was the perfect hunting ground. Unlike towns or settlements where news of disappearances might spread and spark inquiry, the trail was transient. A family might vanish in the hills of eastern Oregon and not be missed for half a year, if ever. Letters took months. Roads were perilous, and death was expected. A missing wagon, just another casualty of the frontier. In the months after the Morrison family was wiped from the map, the Graysons began refining their operation with frightening precision. Brother Ezekiel took to the trail, scouting its approaches on horseback. He was tasked with identifying targets' families that looked well off, traveled alone, or were already suffering from illness or mechanical troubles. He approached with kindness, offering repairs, food, or news of a nearby chapel, offering comfort and care. Sister Constance, meanwhile, began experimenting. She adjusted doses, tweaked ingredients, and tested delivery methods. Her preferred poison arsenic was odorless, tasteless, and easy to acquire under the guise of rodent control from mining camps nearby. It could be slipped into anything: herbal teas, healing tonics, even communion wine. Families drank to their health and died. Father Moray's role was more psychological. He became a master manipulator, tailoring his spiritual rhetoric to suit the denomination of each new victim. To Methodists, he preached healing and miracles. To Presbyterians, he offered comfort in God's immutable plan. To Baptists, he whispered promises of salvation and reunion in heaven. He read grief like scripture, bending it to his will with the practiced ease of a seasoned predator. Even the chapel itself began to evolve. They expanded the basement, carved out separate chambers, one to store the treasures of the dead, another for poison preparation, and a third that served as a temporary morgue. Behind the chapel, hidden among a quiet grove of firs, they dug row after row of unmarked graves. Over the years, that forest will become a silent cemetery, a place where hundreds were laid to rest without headstone, without prayer, without justice. The winter of 1852 into 1853 gave the Graysons their first true off-season months when the trail was buried under snow and nearly empty. But they didn't rest. They used the time to sort through the Morrison family's possessions, choosing which items to keep, which to sell, and which were too recognizable to risk moving. They also took their first step into the black market. With the help of brother Ezekiel, they established contact with shadowy dealers in Oregon's larger towns. These men didn't ask questions. They paid cash, no names required. Fine tools, heirlooms, even children's toys all found buyers. Ezekiel, with his plain face and unassuming manner, was perfect for the job. He posed as a poor settler selling goods for friends who had decided to head back east or died of the flux. He spaced his sales out across different towns and never returned to the same vendor twice in a season. To Merchant, he was just another man trying to survive the hardships of the frontier. But to the Graysons, he was the final link in a chain of murder for profit so seamless it operates in plain sight, and no one suspected a thing. Not all stolen goods are created equal. The Graysons learned quickly that success in murder wasn't just about removing lives. It was about moving inventory, fine furniture, and elegant housewares. These went to wealthier settlers eager to furnish their new frontier homes with a touch of civilization. Tools and farm equipment found buyers among practical homesteaders, men who didn't care where something came from as long as it worked. Jewelry and precious metals disappeared into the hands of quiet merchants who asked no questions and paid in cash. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons were no longer amateurs dabbling in death. They had become professional predators, cold, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. Every step of the process has been refined victim selection method of execution, body disposal, and the laundering of stolen goods. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they had perfected their image. To the outside world, they were still the devout missionaries, the roadside saints of Sacred Heart Chapel. Their reputation as pious caregivers was so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that suspicion didn't just miss them, it actively fled from them. And then spring arrived, and with it more travelers, more wagons, more desperate souls on the move. New victims. Their second major operation came in May, the Hoffman family. German immigrants newly arrived in America speak little English and carrying their entire life savings in a single wagon. They were perfect. The Hoffmans were humble and hardworking. Heinrich Hoffmann, the father, was a master clockmaker with generations of tools and trade goods packed neatly beneath canvas. His wife Greta was heavily pregnant. Their 3 children ranged from 6 to 12, bright-eyed and hopeful. And they were vulnerable. Mechanical trouble forced them to stop near Sacred Heart. And the Graysons greeted them with open arms and practiced smiles. The language barrier only makes things easier. The Hoffmans rely on the Graysons for communication, for understanding, for comfort. What they got instead was poison. Sister Constance didn't wait for illness this time. She introduced her preventative medicine within days. Tiny doses of arsenic, masked in teas, tonics, and blessed water. She told them it would keep trail sickness at bay during their stay. They believed her. Of course they did. My God, Heinrich said in broken English, bowing his head as she handed him a clay cup. You are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for helping us. Sister Constance smiled gently "He already has," she said, her voice soft as silk, "by giving us the opportunity to serve his children." It took nearly a month for the Hoffman family to die. But this slow-motion massacre wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. It allows the Graysons time to catalog every item the family owned, to plan how they will transport and distribute the valuable clockmaking tools, and to observe the family's daily routines. It was a cruel rehearsal for future murders, an extended study in manipulation and logistics. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had murdered 3 entire families. 16 people gone wiped from the earth like chalk from a slate. And for them, this wasn't horror, it was business. And business, as it turned out, was good. They began keeping detailed records, not just of the possessions they stole, but of everything. The poisons used, the mistakes made, the time it took to complete a kill. Each entry became part of a twisted curriculum, a manual for murder dressed in the dry language of bookkeeping. Decades later, when investigators uncovered a hidden compartment in the chapel's basement, they found them ledgers, dozens of them meticulously filled in Father Morai's precise, almost elegant handwriting. Inside were the lives and deaths of every victim, reduced to columns, tallies, and notes. A typical entry reads, "Morrison family 5 souls departed. Sept. Oct. 1852. Possessions 2 gold coins, fine furniture tools. Bodies interred Grove Section C. Estimated profit 400 tons. Method arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration 17 days. Notes: reduce dose frequency to extend duration and reduce suspicion." These weren't the writings of a madman. They were the writings of a businessman, a pastor turned predator, a murderer with a calculator's mind and a priest's smile. And then something strange began to happen. Word of the Graysons' charitable work began to spread. Families traveling west, fearing disease or hardship, starting seeking them out. They had heard the stories, a chapel in the wilderness, staffed by holy folk who healed the sick and buried the dead with grace and dignity. And so pilgrims arrived at Sacred Heart, not as victims, but as volunteers, offering up their trust, their treasures, and their lives on an altar of false hope. They were walking straight into the trap, a trap so expertly woven over time that it no longer looked like danger at all, but like sanctuary. By their second year of operation, the Graysons had refined their enterprise into something much more than a string of murders. This wasn't chaos, it was structure. This wasn't madness, it was business. Under Father Morai's careful direction, the family transitioned from opportunistic killers to cold-blooded strategists. The operation was no longer a series of improvisations. It was a machine, and every cog from poison preparation to psychological control had been oiled with experience. The summer of 1854 would mark a pivotal shift in that machine's evolution. That's when the Graysons met the Weatherby family from Tennessee. Charles Weatherby was no ordinary settler. A former Confederate officer, Charles had chosen the promise of Oregon over the ashes of his ruined plantation. He was disciplined, alert, and unafraid to question what others might blindly accept. His wife, Margaret, was just as formidable, well-read, observant, and cautious. Their 15-year-old twin daughters, Sarah and Susan, accompanying them along with Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith who brought a complete set of precision tools to begin a new life. They were wealthy, prepared, and deeply protected of one another. Charles had converted his remaining assets into portable wealth gold coins and fine jewelry hidden in a secret compartment of their wagon. He had heard the horror stories whispered along the trail tales of families that disappeared after accepting help from the wrong strangers. So, when their wagon wheel cracked near Sacred Heart Chapel, and Brother Ezekiel conveniently appeared to offer assistance, Charles was wary. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles said coolly during his first meeting with Father Morai, "but we've got the tools and hands to handle our own repairs. We'll move on directly." It was the kind of response that might have made a lesser manipulator abandon the plan. But Father Morai was no mere charlatan. He was a master of human psychology. He didn't push. He didn't pressure. Instead, he stepped back with grace, planting a seed of fear with quiet elegance. "I understand completely," he said, voice low and calm. "A wise man protects his family. But Sister Constance has mentioned signs of illness, nearby cholera, dysentery perhaps. You may wish to wait a day or two just to ensure none of your ones have been exposed. Trail fever can be slow to show, but loved, swift to strike." The suggestion landed like a whisper in the wind. Not forceful, just present. And it worked. Margaret Weatherby, bone-tired after months of hard travel and constantly worried about the health of her daughters, began to hesitate. When young David developed a mild sickness fever the very next day, a fever that Sister Constance quickly labeled an early symptom of the regional their resistance cracked. Perhaps, Margaret murmured to her husband, "we should accept their offer. Just until we know David isn't seriously ill." Charles agreed, but not completely. His instincts, honed by years of military leadership, never fully relaxed. He watched the Graysons with cold, calculating eyes. He asked difficult questions. He scrutinized their stories and the subtle details they offered. He had no easy mark. For the Graysons, this wasn't a problem. It was a test, and one they relished. They adapted. Morai, calm and charismatic, responded with a stream of carefully constructed lies. He walked Charles through the cemetery, pointing to grave markers and recounting tales of travelers who arrived too late for salvation, but were given proper Christian burial nevertheless. They even produced testimonial letters, fake of course, allegedly written by grateful settlers who had survived illness under their care and went on to Oregon City in full health. All of it was meant to disarm, and it worked. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the chapel glowed amber in the fading light, Father Morai sat beside Charles on the porch, adopting the tone of a fellow soldier rather than a spiritual leader. "I understand your caution, Brother Charles," he said, his voice heavy with practiced sincerity. "A man who has served learns to watch, learns to question. But think on this. If we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Why would we choose a seasoned soldier armed and alert when easier prey travels this trail every day?" The subtle genius of the statement lay in its flattery. By accelerating Charles's intelligence, Morai made him feel powerful. By pointing out how unlikely it would be for them to attack someone like him, he buried the suspicion beneath a carefully planted compliment. It wasn't just manipulation, it was psychological warfare. And even Charles Weatherby, battle-hardened and wary, began to lower his guard. By suggesting that a trained soldier like Charles would be a poor target, Father Morai planted a dangerous illusion that Charles was safe exactly because he was suspicious. It was a brilliant sleight of hand, the kind that gradually numbed even the most watchful minds. And so the Weatherby family remained at the chapel, walking unknowingly towards their doom. Their murder would unfold over 6 agonizing weeks, the longest and most delicate operation the Graysons had attempted thus far. It will test their methods, refine their strategy, and ultimately confirm the effectiveness of slow, subtle poison. Sister Constance began with minuscule doses of arsenic diluted in what she called blessed water, supposedly infused with prayers and divine healing energy. It was offered to the family as a preventative against trail illnesses, a holy tonic to protect them during their brief recovery. The symptoms were nearly imperceptible at first. A little nausea, a little fatigue. Nothing unusual after months on the trail. David, the youngest and physically most fragile, was the first to fall seriously ill. When he died, Sister Constance's calm explanation that the regional sickness had taken him, despite her best efforts, was accepted without question. Margaret, devastated by her brother's death, leaned even more heavily on the woman she believed was a saint. Next, Margaret herself began showing signs of illness. The Graysons explained it away. The emotional strain, the exhaustion, the stress of caring for the sick. It all made sense until it didn't. Charles Weatherby, the former officer, had spent years analyzing battlefields. And now something wasn't adding up. His daughters were still healthy. He felt fine. Yet everyone else was dying, always, slowly, always under the Graysons' care. The pattern began to haunt him. And then came the turning point. Late one night, Charles caught brother Ezekiel rifling through the wagon. When confronted, Ezekiel smiled sheepishly and claimed he was checking to ensure that wild animals hadn't disturbed their supplies. It was plausible. Almost. Almost. But not quite. The next morning, as Margaret lay pale and wheezing, Charles knelt by her side. "Margaret," he whispered, "we have to leave this place. Something's wrong. I can feel it." But it was already too late. Margaret was too weak to move. And Charles knew that taking her would kill her. So he stayed torn between his growing fear and his loyalty to the woman he loved. That's when he made the discovery that everything confirmed. Searching the chapel's basement for medical supplies, Charles noticed a slight draft behind a stacked shelf. Moving it aside, he found a hidden compartment, a storage space filled with items that didn't belong to the Graysons, things that should have never been there. A small, hand-stitched child's doll, still faintly smelling of lavender. A silver pocket watch engraved with initials Charles didn't recognize. And most damning of all, a letter. It was addressed to a relative in Oregon City, dated just weeks prior. In it, a woman described arrived safely at Sacred Heart Chapel, and thanked God for the Grayson's kindness as her children recovered from illness. But the letter had never been sent. It had been hidden, buried with the rest of the evidence. Charles's heart sank. The pattern was clear. His family was being poisoned. They were just the latest names on a list of victims. He ran upstairs, but again, too late. That night Margaret died, and the next morning, Charles awoke with searing stomach pain, muscle tremors, and violent nausea, the same symptoms he had watched claim the lives of David and Margaret. What he didn't know was that Father Morai had already decided he was too dangerous. The preacher had slipped a massive dose of arsenic into Charles's meal the previous night, sealing his fate. As Charles lay dying, his twin daughters at his side, he summoned the last of his strength to try and warn them. "Don't trust them," he gasped. "They're not who they say they are." But his daughters, grief-stricken and naive, dismissed his words as fevered rambling. They clung to the hands of Sister Constance, who soothed them with prayers and promised to care for them like her own. Just days later, they too will fall ill. The Weatherby case became a major learning experience for the Graysons. They had encountered a family that was strong, intelligent, and suspicious, and still succeeded, but not without risk. And so they took away 3 critical lessons. Smart victims require smarter lies. Flattery and feigned respect went further than pressure or fear. Longer timelines build stronger illusions. The slower the death, the more natural it appears. Suspicion must be monitored and neutralized. Anyone who asked too many questions could not be allowed to act on their doubts. By the end of it all, the Graysons weren't just better killers. They were masters of the dragon children. Murderers by faith, merchants by design, and manipulators without peer. And the Oregon Trail remains none the wiser. Most importantly, the Weatherby case showed that even highly trained, intelligent, and suspicious people could be duped and murdered if psychological techniques were applied patiently and skillfully enough. This realization gave the Graysons more confidence enough to target wealthy, prominent families who would be noticed if they disappeared. It was also from that incident that they improved their evidence disposal procedures. Personal items that could identify victims were burned. Jewelry and precious metals were melted down to remove traces, and hiding places became more elaborate, from wall niches and secret drawers to underground vaults hidden behind chapel paneling. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people from 7 different families. What had started as a brutal murder spree had evolved into a professionally run criminal enterprise that was both hugely profitable and kept completely secret. And the scariest thing, they no longer thought of themselves as criminals. They believed themselves to be instruments of God's will, blessed to prosper from the wealth of chosen ones for sacrifice. The year 1855 marked the biggest turning point in their bloody career. For the first time, they encountered a victim who did not die, and who saw enough to expose the whole truth. It all started as usual with the Patterson family from Ohio. Thomas Patterson is a successful businessman who has just liquidated his business to pursue opportunities in Oregon. He is accompanied by his wife, Emily, 4 children, ages 8 to 16, and Emily's sister, Catherine, an unmarried woman who works as a teacher. and is the primary caregiver for the children. The Graysons were interested not only in their wealth. Thomas brought gold paper money and commercial property, but also in their standing in the community. If the Pattersons disappeared, many people would take notice both in Ohio and Oregon. When the Patterson convoys split from the main group near the Blue Mountains, they were traveling alone. They had no problems, no broken vehicles, no sick people. But Ezekiel didn't need trouble to set a trap. "Good afternoon," Sir Ezekiel called out when he saw Patterson's party. "Your oxen are excellent. We have provisions and medicines in the chapel up ahead, which we could trade for some goods if you would like." Thomas, ever the seasoned merchant, was instantly alert. There was something in Ezekiel's eyes that made him uneasy. "Thank you, but we have enough to carry us on," he replied politely but firmly. Ezekiel smiled faintly. He had been prepared for this situation. "Oh, of course I understand. It's just, we've had a few cases of mountain fever lately. It's a slow onset illness, and by the time it's discovered, the patient is too sick to leave. Our sister Constance, the nurse, has a very effective preventative remedy, so I thought you'd stop by just to be sure." From behind, Emily Patterson paled. As a mother, the word sick was enough to make her heart clench. "Thomas, if there really is a plague, we shouldn't risk the children," she whispered. Most importantly, the Weatherby case showed that even highly trained, intelligent, and suspicious people could be duped and murdered if psychological techniques were applied patiently and skillfully enough. This realization gave the Graysons more confidence enough to target wealthy, prominent families who would be noticed if they disappeared. It was also from that incident that they improved their evidence disposal procedures. Personal items that could identify victims were burned. Jewelry and precious metals were melted down to remove traces. And hiding places became more elaborate, from wall niches and secret drawers to underground vaults hidden behind chapel paneling. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people from 7 different families. What had started as a brutal murder spree had evolved into a professionally run criminal enterprise that was both hugely profitable and kept completely secret. And the scariest thing, they no longer thought of themselves as criminals. They believed themselves to be instruments of God's will, blessed to prosper from the wealth of chosen ones for sacrifice. The year 1855 marked the biggest turning point in their bloody career. For the first time, they encountered a victim who did not die, and who saw enough to expose the whole truth. It all started as usual with the Patterson family from Ohio. Thomas Patterson is a successful businessman who has just liquidated his business to pursue opportunities in Oregon. He is accompanied by his wife, Emily, 4 children, ages 8 to 16, and Emily's sister, Catherine, an unmarried woman who works as a teacher and is the primary caregiver for the children. The Graysons were interested not only in their wealth. Thomas brought gold paper money and commercial property, but also in their standing in the community. If the Pattersons disappeared, many people would take notice both in Ohio and Oregon. When the Patterson convoy split from the main group near the Blue Mountains, they were traveling alone. They had no problems, no broken vehicles, no sick people. But Ezekiel didn't need trouble to set a trap. "Good afternoon, Sir Ezekiel," called out when he saw Patterson's party. "Your oxen are excellent. We have provisions and medicines in the chapel up ahead, which we could trade for some goods if you would like." Thomas, ever the seasoned merchant, was instantly alert. There was something in Ezekiel's eyes that made him uneasy. "Thank you, but we have enough to carry us on," he replied politely but firmly. Ezekiel smiled faintly. He had been prepared for this situation. "Oh, of course I understand. It's just, we've had a few cases of mountain fever lately. It's a slow onset illness, and by the time it's discovered, the patient is too sick to leave. Our sister Constance, the nurse, has a very effective preventative remedy, so I thought you'd stop by just to be sure." From behind, Emily Patterson paled. As a mother, the word sick was enough to make her heart clench. "Thomas, if there really is a plague, we shouldn't risk the children," she whispered. Thomas reluctantly agreed to stop. They were just going to ask a few questions, then move on. Little did he know that his decision would land his family in a... Grayson greeted them as usual with sweet, calculating kindness. Morai talked business with Thomas, creating a sense of familiarity. Constance was childlike, gentle, and motherly. Ezekiel told jokes, keeping the children laughing. Before long, the Patterson family agreed to stay overnight to be examined. The examination, of course, revealed that several members had signs of mountain fever and medication was needed immediately. Emily's younger sister, Catherine, was the first to receive the drug. A caring and devoted woman, she immediately urged the whole family to get treatment. But Catherine was different from the previous victims. She is observant. On the second night, she saw Ezekiel quietly going through their car, listing each item. When Constance asked, she simply said, "We do this because we are afraid of thieves and customers losing their stuff." The reason sounded reasonable, but Catherine began to be wary. She saw Morai's eyes linger too long on Thomas's gold watch. She noticed that Constance always mixed the potion alone. No one was allowed to look. And then, the fourth night, Catherine caught Constance sprinkling a white powder into baby Timothy's medicine bowl. When asked, Constance replied, "It is holy salt. It enhances the potency of the medicine." But Catherine had lived in her father's drugstore in Ohio. She knew that the powder was not salt, and Constance's confused, flustered demeanor when asked was far from her usual calm. That night, Catherine decided to strike back. When given the medicine, she pretended to drink it, then spat it into her handkerchief. And with that simple act, she began the fight to save herself and her family. The escape was a waking nightmare, 3 days and nights of fear, exhaustion, and barely contained horror. Emily, ravaged by weeks of slow poisoning, slipped in and out of consciousness, her voice sometimes barely a whisper, sometimes crying out for the husband and children already buried behind them. Catherine, driven by grief and grim resolution, took the reins. She guided the wagon over unfamiliar terrain, following barely visible game trails, praying with every turn that they'd find someone, anyone, before the Graysons realized they were gone. Little Timothy, the youngest. Patterson sat in silent shock beside her. His once bright eyes were now dimmed with unspeakable trauma. He said almost nothing. He didn't cry, didn't ask where his father was, didn't even ask where they were going. The only thing that moved was his chest rising and falling as if breath alone tethered him to this world. On the fourth day, battered by exposure, hunger, and despair, the broken family saw movement ahead. A military patrol from Fort Dalles investigation reports of native unrest in the region. Catherine waved them down with the last of her strength, her voice hoarse as she pleaded for help. Her tale of murder, poison, and a chapel soaked in false piety sounds like the ravings of a madwoman. But Catherine had come prepared. She had saved a vial of Sister Constance's medicine samples of the mysterious white powder and a list of items she'd seen Brother Ezekiel inventory with greedy hands. Most damning of all, she had Emily barely lucid, but with visible symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Her trembling fingers, her sunken eyes, her failing organs, these were things no imagination could imagine. The soldiers listened, then they acted. The investigation that followed would uncover the full depravity of what had transpired at the Sacred Heart Chapel, and just how narrowly the survivors had escaped. When troops arrived at the chapel, they found Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children dead, their bodies twisted in pain, clearly marked by the telltale signs of arsenic toxicity. But the Graysons themselves had disappeared, gone, along with the most valuable contents of their secret stash, buried deep beneath the chapel floor. What they left behind, however, told a story far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. In hidden chambers beneath the sanctuary, soldiers uncovered a ghastly archive, neatly sorted belongings from dozens of murdered families, children's toys, wedding rings, heirloom Bibles, blood-stained dolls. But worse still were the ledgers written in Father Morai's meticulous hand. These records detail each family's arrival treatment timeline to death and the profits earned from selling their possessions. The ledger entry for the Pattersons was particularly chilling. Family 37. Estimated revenue $1,400 in coin and trade goods. Method arsenic via spiritual teas. Notable resistance from male head. Timeline extended. Partial escape response evacuation. In just under 3 years, the Graysons had murdered over 150 people. Catherine's survival and her unyielding testimony would mark the beginning of the end for the Grayson family enterprise. But justice, as it so often does on the frontier, came slowly. Authorities would spend years trying to piece together the full magnitude of the crimes, and even longer attempting to capture those responsible. And for the 3 survivors, escape did not mean peace. Emily Patterson never recovered. Her body, ravaged by the long exposure to poison, failed slowly, and she died within a year of their return to civilization. Her last words, Catherine would later say, were whispering prayers for the children she had lost. Timothy, only 8 when it happened, would grow up bearing invisible scars. He never again set foot in a church. He mistrusted authority, shunned intimacy, and was haunted by recurring nightmares of candlelight prayers, bloodied linens, and the hollow, smiling face of Sister Constance. Catherine, however, turned her trauma into purpose. She became obsessed with justice. Her testimony before military tribunals, territorial courts, and eventually federal marshals was the cornerstone of the investigation. She remembered the names in the ledgers, the layouts of the graves, the pattern of manipulation. She became the map to understand the monster. But as the authorities began closing in, the Graysons were already 2 steps ahead. They had prepared for this. With stolen wealth, deep knowledge of remote territory, and years of practice erasing their footprints, the family disappeared into the frontier like smoke on the wind. They had new names, new disguises, and a long list of backup identities cultivated for just such a moment. The man assigned to track them, U.S. Marshal William Hriss, faced a challenge unlike any he'd encountered before. These weren't common fugitives. They were a criminal organization, disguised as saints, who had transformed religious charity into a mask for ritualized mass murder. And so the chase began, not just for the Graysons' arrest, but for truth, justice, and the unmasking of evil that had worn a cross around its neck. The raid on the Mission of Divine Mercy, April 1857. At exactly 2:00 a.m., under the cover of darkness, federal agents and soldiers surrounded the mission. 2 squads approached the main building from opposite flanks, while the others sealed off outbuildings and escape routes. Hriss led the central assault himself, a lantern in one hand and a Colt revolver in the other. They breached the mission doors in one explosive wave of boots and splintering wood. Inside, the agents found the Henderson family drugged, but alive, tied to cots in the infirmary. Father Benedict Morai had been preparing his final blessing when they broke in, and for the first time in his long criminal career, he was caught speechless. Sister Mary Constance attempted to flee through a rear passage, but a soldier tackled her before she could reach the hidden tunnel that led to the woods. Brother Thomas Ezekiel fought briefly, but was subdued after firing a single shot that grazed a federal agent's shoulder. What followed was a systematic search of the compound that confirmed the worst of Hriss's fears. The Graysons had built a machine for murder. In the basement, they found rows of labeled bottles, arsenic belladonna laudanum, alongside forged medical texts and spiritual guides. One room had metal tubs used for dissolving bodies. Another housed the now familiar storage crates filled with victims' treasures, journals, gold coins, heirlooms, children's toys, even letters never mailed. Behind the mission, they uncovered a mass grave barely concealed beneath a grove of scrub pines. Later excavation will reveal more than 30 bodies, many of them women and children. But the most haunting discovery came in Father Morai's private study. Their agents found a new ledger larger and more methodical than the one recovered at Sacred Heart Chapel. The cover read simply, "Divine Mercy Accounts." Inside, in tight clerical script, were entries detailing 12 more families. Each line noted the victims' names, their travel routes, symptoms, administered treatments, time to death, profits earned, spiritual justifications, the arrests, and the trial. The Graysons were transported under heavy guard to San Francisco, where their trial became one of the most sensational events in early American history. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily. Newspapers ran lurid headlines like "Priests of Death Captured" and "Holy House of Horror." Catherine Patterson, then 36, traveled west to testify in person. Her calm, methodical testimony, backed by her original journals and detailed memory, was the prosecution's crown jewel. They wore the robes of salvation, she told the court, but their hearts were as black as the poison they served. Each Grayson denies the charges. Morai claimed they were victims of a vast anti-Christian conspiracy, while Constance wept theatrically on the stand, portraying herself as a misunderstood healer. Ezekiel said nothing, staring at the floor as if already entombed in his own guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. All three were found guilty of multiple counts of premeditated murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, visibly shaken as he read the list of the dead, aloud sentenced all three to hang by the neck until death. "May God have mercy on your souls," he said, "though I doubt he'll find any left to save." Aftermath echoes on the trail. The executions were carried out in January 1858, testified by hundreds, including survivors of the murdered families. The gallows were built high not just for justice, but as a warning. But justice did not erase the scars. Many travelers, upon hearing the true story of the Graysons, refused to take the trail west unless escorted by armed guards or in groups of dozens. The phrase "beware of chapels" became a whispered warning among wagon trains. Catherine Patterson never married. She dedicated the rest of her life to victim advocacy, helping found an early version of what would become the Pioneer Protection Bureau, lobbying for safer trail travel and better record-keeping of emigrant families. Young Timothy, now orphaned and forever wary of strangers, grew into a quiet but fiercely moral man. He will later become a judge, one known for never allowing religious appeals to influence judgment, and for one haunting quote, "A wolf in a collar is still a wolf." The interrogations of the Grayson family reveal a chilling truth. They did not see themselves as murderers. In their minds, they were chosen elevated above the common morality of men, agents of a divine order that justified every act of poison and theft. To the outside world, they were butchers, but to themselves, they were clerics of cleansing, purging the trail of the weak, the foreign, the unlucky. Psychological profile of the Graysons. Federal investigators working with early forensic psychologists began compiling what was then an unprecedented criminal profile. Father Morai, alias Benedict Morrison, was identified as the ideological leader, a narcissistic mastermind whose theology had warped into a doctrine of selective mercy and profitable salvation. His journals display increasing delusions of grandeur over the years. "We are not killing," he wrote in 1856. "We are harvesting souls for God's garden. Our reward is not in heaven alone, it is in the gold and silver of the faithless." Sister Constance Mary Morrison was described as the most outwardly devout, but psychologically the most dangerous. Investigators noted her disturbing calm during questioning, even when confronted with the names and faces of child victims. She truly believed her medicinal role was a holy vocation. "Pain is the price of purification," she told a young female interrogator. "Would you rather your child die in a ditch alone or held by the hands of the righteous?" Brother Ezekiel. Thomas Morrison remains enigmatic. He spoke no words during the 3 weeks of questioning. He refused food unless blessed. It was later revealed that he had taken a vow of silence in 1854, inscribed in the back of one of Morai's books, "My tongue is the sword that leads to sin. I shall act, not speak." Public reaction and trial. When news of the raid and the evidence at the Mission of Divine Mercy became public, it caused mass hysteria across the frontier. Hundreds of families came forward, claim to have seen the Graysons or stayed at safe stations that now feel suspicious. Fear of traveling alone surged. Makeshift militias formed to escort wagon trains and trailside missions were viewed with deep suspicion, even burned in some cases by angry mobs. The trial of the Graysons, held in Sacramento in the winter of 1857, was the largest criminal proceeding in U.S. frontier history up to that point. The courtroom was packed every day. Portrait sketches of the defendants appeared in newspapers across the nation. Survivors like James Henderson and Catherine Patterson were brought in under military guard to testify. Catherine's testimony was particularly devastating. She walked the jury through the ritualistic structure of the poisonings, the sickening professionalism of the ledgers, and even read from Morai's own words about how the Lord's servants must accept the burdens of blood. The prosecution ended with a dramatic presentation, a child's doll covered in trail dust retrieved from the chapel vault. It had belonged to Sarah Morrison, age 8, murdered in 1856. Sentencing and execution. On March 3, 1858, all 3 Graysons were sentenced to death by hanging. The judge, visibly emotional, declared, "You wore the cloak of salvation while drinking the blood of the innocents. Your punishment will not only serve justice, it will serve memory." They were executed 1 week later at Fort Dalles. Over 800 people participated. Before the nose was placed, Sister Constance looked to the sky and said, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend these martyrs." Ezekiel made no sound. Morai's last words were whispered, but recorded by a nearby soldier. "We will rise again, not as men, but as angels." Legacy. The Grayson case led to several key developments in U.S. frontier law enforcement. The formation of the Trail Registry Act of 1859, requiring wagon parties to register at major forts and provide names, destinations, and known associates. The creation of the Frontier Chaplaincy Bureau, a government-recognized system for credentialing and monitoring religious missions along migration routes. The establishment of the Victims' Gravesite Commission, which recovered, identified, and buried more than 60 bodies linked to the Graysons by 1870. Catherine Patterson returned to Ohio and became a public speaker and activist. Her memoir, Wolves' Investments, became a bestseller and is still used in criminology classes today. She never married, never stopped investigating. James Henderson and his family relocated to San Francisco, where he founded Henderson and Sons Security Freight, one of the first armed trail freight companies on the Pacific frontier. His youngest child, the one nearly poisoned, lived to be 92 and was known as the boy who survived the angels of death. The Grayson trial became more than a legal proceeding, it became a national reckoning. In dusty courtrooms, packed beyond fire safety regulations, crowds gathered each day not merely to witness the verdict, but to understand how such horror had hidden behind holy symbols. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the angels of death, and dime novelists began romanticizing and demonizing the eerie family whose piety had cloaked hundreds of murders. Father Morai's final performance. Throughout the 6-week trial, Father Morai's real name, still debated, sat with unsettling composure. No tears, no remorse, no anger. Only when his own journals were read aloud did he show any reaction, a faint, almost proud smile. In one entry dated February 1856, he wrote, "The Lord tests his servants not by denying them joy, but by giving them the means to take it from others." When the prosecution introduced Map Ninos 12, a hand-drawn diagram found in the Mission of Divine Mercy's cellar showing the location of burial efficiency zones, the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy that even the presiding judge paused before continuing. One corner of the map was labeled for the unclean and unprofitable. Sister Constance's defiance. Unlike her brother, Sister Constance became increasingly vocal during the trial. She occasionally interrupted testimony, scoffing aloud at survivor testimonies, or correcting details of the procedures. "If I had wanted them dead in a day, they'd have been dead in a day," she snapped during Catherine Patterson's recounting of her escape. The method was the mercy. To one journalist, she gave a chilling quote during a recess. "People always want to believe in mercy. They believe we offered it even while we stripped their children's breath from their lungs. That's not murder. That's faith management." Her court-appointed defense attorney eventually refused to represent her after she insisted on cross-examining a 10-year-old Henderson child herself. Brother Ezekiel's stillness. Ezekiel, the youngest and physically strongest of the Graysons, remained almost spectral during the trial. He neither responded to the charges nor acknowledged his siblings. A trail investigator investigated that Ezekiel had likely been the one disposing of bodies based on the journal notes referring to T. cleans the field. He didn't utter a single word until the final judgment day. When asked by the judge whether he had anything to say before judgment, Ezekiel stood, looked at the packed courtroom, and said, "God never judged Cain." Then he sat down, verdict, and execution. On October 29, 1857, after only 6 hours of jury deliberation, all 3 Grayson family members were found guilty of multiple counts of premeditated murder, conspiracy, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The judge, visibly shaken, ordered execution by hanging to be carried out in public, citing the extraordinary nature of the crimes and the need for communal closure. The execution was held at Fort Dalles on November 9th, attended by over 200 people, including dozens of survivors, relatives of victims, and lawmen who had worked the case. One minister reads the 23rd Psalm. Another, determined to attend, wrote in a letter to the Oregonian, "They do not deserve a shepherd's prayer. They wore the word like a wolf wears wool." At the gallows, Father Morai declined a blindfold, smiled at the crowd, and said, "You'll bury our bodies, but our ideas are already seeded." Sister Constance sang a lullaby until the trapdoor opened. Ezekiel looked at the sky, murmured something no one could hear, and died silently. Aftermath and legacy. The Grayson murders transformed the Western frontier in profound ways. Several lasting effects included: 1. Legislative Reform Congress passed the Frontier Protection Act of 1858, which funded roving federal marshals to monitor remote religious sites, required licensing and audits for frontier medical missionaries, established the National Register of Wagon Train Disappearances, a precursor to missing persons databases. 2. Psychological study doctors at the newly established American Institute of Mental Health used the Grayson case as the basis for early studies in group psychopathy and religious delusion-induced sociopathy. The term Grayson syndrome was coined to describe individuals who justify violence through distorted theological frameworks. 3. Cultural impact stories of the Graysons entered American folklore. Campfire told tales of the ghost chapel of the Oregon Trail where poisoned souls still walk, and of a preacher's voice heard in the hills promising safety that ends in silence. Their story inspired 5 novels, 3 silent films, and one 1980s horror movie, Trail of the Unblessed. 4. The Survivor's Crusade. Catherine Patterson, who never married, dedicated her life to victim advocacy. She proved before Congress in 1860, successfully lobbying for legislation that improved protections for women and children on westward migration routes. Her 1862 book, The Kind Face of Death, sold 150,000 copies and helped pioneer investigative memoir writing in the U.S. She died in 1889, age 65, surrounded by school children she had taught. Her last words reported were, "They thought they were shepherds, but they never saw the fire in the lamb's eyes." The case highlighted the vulnerability of westward migrants and the ease with which predators could exploit the trust and desperation of families seeking help in isolated areas. Father Morai Grayson was convicted on charges of multiple murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Sister Constance Grayson was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, making her one of the first women in American frontier history to receive such a severe sentence for criminal activity. Brother Ezekiel Grayson was convicted as an accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The executions and imprisonment of the Grayson family marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American frontier history. But the impact of their crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case fundamentally changed how travelers approached offers of help from strangers and led to increased military patrols along major travel routes. Religious communities throughout the frontier territories were forced to confront the reality that their faith and charitable instincts could be exploited by predators who understood how to manipulate Christian charity for evil purposes. Many legitimate missionaries and religious workers found that their efforts to help travelers were met with suspicion and fear as people struggled to distinguish between genuine charitable work and potential criminal activity. The Graysons' crimes also exposed significant weaknesses in frontier law enforcement and communication systems. The family had been able to operate for more than a decade without detection, partly because there was no effective way for authorities in different territories to share information about suspicious activities or missing persons. The case led to improvements in interterritorial communication and the establishment of more systematic approaches to investigating missing persons reports. Catherine Patterson, the survivor whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never fully recovered from her traumatic experience with the Grayson family. She spent the remainder of her life advocating for improved protection of travelers and working with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate suspicious activities at remote religious sites. Her nephew, Timothy, the young boy who had survived the family's attempted murder, grew to adulthood, bearing psychological scars that affected his entire life. He never married, never had children of his own, and spent his adult years working as a frontier guide, helping other families avoid the dangers that had destroyed his own family. The physical locations where the Grayson had operated were abandoned and eventually destroyed by local communities that wanted to eliminate all traces of the horrible crimes that had been committed there. The Sacred Heart Chapel was burned to the ground in 1858, and the Mission of Divine Mercy was dismantled and its materials used for other construction projects. But the psychological impact of the Graysons' crimes lingered for generations. Families throughout the Western Territories told stories about the false missionaries who had murdered hundreds of innocent people, using these tales as warnings about the dangers of trusting strangers who offered help on isolated trails. The case also raised disturbing questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. Father Murray's sister Constance and brother Ezekiel had not been obviously deranged or visibly dangerous individuals. They had been intelligent, articulate people who had successfully posed as charitable Christians for more than a decade. Their ability to maintain their facade while systematically murdering innocent families challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the reliability of religious authority. The case demonstrated that evil could be methodical, organized, and sustained over long periods by people who appeared to be pillars of their communities. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the Grayson had genuinely believed that their actions were justified and had convinced themselves that they were performing a service by eliminating weak and diseased travelers while redistributing their possessions to more deserving recipients. Their self-righteousness and lack of remorse suggested a form of moral corruption that was far more dangerous than simple greed or desperation. The legacy of the Grayson family murders serves as a reminder that the American frontier was shaped not just by the courage and determination of honest pioneers, but also by the predators who sought to exploit their vulnerability and trust. The 800 people who died at the hands of the false missionaries represent a dark chapter in the story of westward expansion, a chapter that reveals the full range of human capacity for both good and evil. Their story stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, the dangers of blind trust, and the terrible price that innocent people can pay when evil disguises itself as righteousness. In the end, the Graysons' crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who understand exactly how to exploit our noblest instincts for their own malevolent purposes. Today, more than a century and a half after the Graysons met their justice, their story continues to haunt the collective memory of the American West. The families they destroyed, the trust they betrayed, and the lives they cut short serve as permanent reminders that evil can flourish anywhere. Human vulnerability and desperation create opportunities for exploitation. The courage of survivors like Catherine Patterson, who risked everything to expose the truth and seek justice for the dead, provides a counterpoint to the darkness of the Graysons' legacy. Her testimony not only brought the killers to justice, but also saved countless future lives by alerting authorities and the public to the dangers posed by predators who used religious authority to mask their criminal activities. In remembering the Grayson family's crimes, we honor not just the victims who died, but also the survivors who found the strength to fight back against evil and ensure that justice was finally served. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are always those who will stand up for truth and refuse to let evil triumph unchallenged. What do you think about this chilling tale from America's frontier past? Does it change how you view the romanticized stories of westward expansion? The Grayson family's systematic exploitation of Christian charity reveals the darkest aspects of human nature and the terrible price of misplaced trust. If this story has given you chills and made you think about the hidden dangers that lurked on the frontier trails, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content that brings these forgotten horrors to light, and subscribe so you never miss the disturbing truths that shaped America's past. The next time you hear stories about the brave pioneers who conquered the American West, remember that they also had to survive predators like the Grayson's people, who turned murder into a family business and hid their evil behind the mask of religious devotion.